Hey, I'm Kyle, and you're watching The Newfoundland Hobbyist.
Hey, I'm Kyle. Take such good care of this one. Right on this triangle here.
The Newfoundland Hobbyist is sponsored by Mid-Island Motorsports, located in Springdale, Newfoundland. www.edgeproinc.com. By the Sea Inn and Cafe, located in Kings Point. And Outdoor Pros, located in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland.
In the year 1901, a man named Hoyt Buck, a blacksmith, started out making knives from old files. Now, I believe he was also a member of the clergy, and he sort of set up shop in the basement of a church that he was pastoring at. He went on and on with that, eventually incorporated his son, Al Buck. Later, they were predecessed by the son of Al, which was Chuck Buck, and now I believe a man by the name of C.J. Buck is the head, the runner, the CEO, the president of the company, Buck Knives. Now today, we're going to be talking and working with the Buck 110. Now, Buck Knives came up with the Buck 110, sorry. If you guys have been into the woods sort of market, or the camping, the hiking market, hunting and fishing market, you've seen this knife right here. Now, there are a lot of imitators. You can go to Canadian Tire, and there are probably 3 or 4 models that look just like this or very similar on the rack, but only one is the legendary Buck 110. Now, about a year ago, I was approached by someone who asked if I could customize a Buck 110 from him. And after a little bit of research, a little bit of playing around, a little bit of trial and error, I figured, well, if Buck can customize them for you, then certainly there must be a foolproof way of doing it yourself. And that is where this video comes in. So I'm going to show you today how to basically take this Buck 110 and rebuild it, rehandle it, so that you have something even more special and custom that you can tailor to your design. We're just going to make this knife totally different. We're going to transform it into something that's more of an heirloom than just this base model. This base model here you can pick up for somewhere around $70, I believe. It sells for regularly at Canadian Tire. Sometimes you get it on sale, but I'm going to show you how to transform it. Now, before you start cutting in and hacking away at your beautiful knife, you need to understand how these knives are assembled, or the order of operations to disassemble. Because if you just start cutting away stuff, you might make a mess, you might mess something up and not be able to repair it. So this lock bar here, this has one torsion bar that comes up and under it on an angle like this. It's kept inside this rear bolster. Now, when you push on the lock bar, you notice it has quite a bit of tension and it springs back up nice and tight. You are compressing that torsion bar that's down in here. You're also pivoting on this steel pin right here, and if you see, that goes all the way through. Now, these scales here, you can see we have 2 individual pieces. We're going to have to ruin these to take them off. They're kept on with these little brass pins. These little brass pins only go so far as the inside of the brass liner on each side. So the first thing to do is grind off the heads of all 6 of those brass pins, and then we only need to grind off the head of one side of the stainless pin. And that's the quick and dirty way of doing it right there, is just to grind the heads off them. Now, we don't need to grind off the other side of that stainless pin, because we can just tap that through the back side. Now, the next step would be to tap out that stainless pin from the side that you ground the head off, of course. That's a nice hefty 1/8 inch pin, so just a nice cold punch like this. And there is that lock bar. This is the part I was saying, the overhang that grabs onto your blade, right there. We're going to put this back. We're going to do some work with this later. Now I've done quite a few of these, and the best way I have found to remove those scales is to take just like an X-Acto blade, utility knife blade like this, get the edge started in there, just give it a little tap, and you can see it already is starting to open those scales off of the knife. It's just out a little bit there. You can start to work it out. You don't want to pry a lot, because when you're prying against the scale, you're going to pry your liner in, and that's brass, so it's kind of soft. So you can work it a little bit, just like this. And you remove your scale. And here are the little pieces of brass pin that we clipped off and pushed back in through the knife. So they're garbage. We won't need that anymore. Now once that's done, we can repeat the exact same set of steps for the other side, the other scale. Nice and gentle. Now you would be wise to hang on with those factory rosewood scales, because you can use those to trace out for your new scales later on. So we'll put those aside. And the next step we're going to do is something you might want to forego. I've done it several times now, and we're going to do it with this knife, and that is to do a tang filing on this knife. It really adds a unique and really extravagant look to the knife, but it is, or it can be, a little bit tricky. So if you want to file the tang, what you're going to want to do first is to reinstall that torsion bar. Now you'll do that through the top. You can look right down and see a slot in there. You can just fall it right back in there. It's pretty easy. Give it a little push to make sure it's seated. Once that's done, you can lay your lock bar back in there. Now you don't need to squeeze it in and put in that pin. This will do good enough for us to do some layout here. Now in theory, filing the tang of a knife can be done with pretty much any knife, and it's relatively simple. You have your tang of the knife, which is this piece of steel, of course, just the bridge or the actual spine of the knife. Now you can file different designs into that tang. I like patterns, and I like fairly simple patterns. Some people get really crazy with it, but you want to come up with what you want that pattern to look like. I really like just a simple winding pattern like this. Looks really nice all the way up along. So what you need to do is you can only take away material, and the highest part is the part that's going to be the light color, and the low is going to be dark. I like this ridge here to be nice and bright like this. So that means this part has to be filed away, and we leave the high part, and that'll be polished when we finish the knife. You'll be able to see. Well, you don't need like a micrometer or anything for this. Your eye isn't that sharp, and even if it was, you're not going to be able to file and engrave that accurately. Now let me show you guys something really cool. This right here is a vise that belonged to my grandfather, Noseworthy. Now he's still around, but he has late stage dementia, and he's not really around, if you know what I mean. But this is a vise that he used to have. All my growing up, I remember this bolted to the corner of his bench, and I used it making little wooden boats and making little projects and stuff. Spent a lot of time with Pop Noseworthy when I was young, but he would always give me a little project to do, give me the handsaw, give me the axe, and I would work away on the belt sander, different tools like that. People like that in your life, of course, that that set you on the path of being a crafty person or being good at working with your hands. But this little bench vise here, it looks like a little 3-inch bench vise. I don't think it's anything overly special. But what I want to show you is the setup to mount it here. Now you see I used a little bit of plywood and then a piece of 2x4 screwed together. I bolted, and you need it to be flush. I flush mounted my vise to that, and now I have a removable machinist vise that you can crank down, and it's installed on your bench, so you can easily take it out of the way for when you don't want to use it, but you do have a nice solid vise there for working. So if you do happen to have a woodworking bench like this, or a good bench, and you do have a woodworking vise, this is an easy way to set up, so you can still have your machinist vise, but also remove it so you have that flush countertop as well. Now ideally you want to hog out this material on roughly a 45-degree angle. You want to do that as quick as possible. I'm going to use my burr bit again on my die grinder, just because this is a nice size. It cuts really quickly, and I don't have to force anything. I can just nice and lightly whittle it away. Now I have done these with a Dremel, with just a little grinding disc or those little sanding wheels, right? You just file that out slowly. And I started doing these by hand, so I'd start off with just a chainsaw file, start working that out, move through different types of files. We'll probably do some work with the files today, but like I said, I'm going to start hogging that material out, get it as close as I can to the final product with this die grinder. Now as always, safety is most important when you're using a tool like this, because they throw a lot of material, a lot of shards. I'd say that looks pretty good. Looks nice and even. I can see a few waves are just slightly out of sync, but overall looks good. You can see the finish is nice. If you're happy with it, now is when you actually start the reassembly process.
The Newfoundland Hobbyist is sponsored by paulsfinest.com. Noble's Timber Mart, with locations in Springdale and Bayvert. wildmedkits.ca. Robinson's General Store, located in Middle Arm. And ABS Busing, also located in Middle Arm, Newfoundland.
Now you'll notice that inside on the frame of this knife, where this pin passes through, remember the scales go on here, so this pin goes all the way through to the outside of the scales. Yet inside on the frame here, get a little pointer, you see we have, this is actually chamfered all the way around, a nice wide chamfer. And I believe this is for the custom shop to put a pin inside there, just like we're going to do. So we have a pin head on this side, we only ground off one side. We're going to push that pin all the way through, and you can see as it passes through there, that pin head sits pretty well flush with the frame of the knife here, right in that recess. Isn't that nice? Now when we remove the compression from the vise, everything is held. This pin now has all that pressure on it, so this knife is going to work just like it did from factory, right? But of course we have all of this excess pin because this was sitting out on the surface of the scales. So what we need to do now is cut this pin off so we have just enough material to pin down inside that frame. Now my favorite way to peen is to clamp a ball peen hammer, a larger one, in my woodworking vise. And that gives me a very concentrated point of hammering. Rather than trying to get it right on a flat surface, I like having that crest of the peen of the hammer to really concentrate. You have to be a little bit more accurate with how you position, but I find you get the most like density behind, the most effective peening. Now you also want to be really careful when peening, because the tighter this gets, the more it's going to pinch that frame in the lock bar and make the lock bar difficult to operate. And it doesn't take much to start to malform the head of that pin. You only need enough so it doesn't back out, which it's not going to do anyways because it has a scale there. But you like to make it somewhat permanent, do a good job. Just make sure you don't over tighten that pin. Now the next part of this project here is where you'll be glad that you saved the original scales, because these are going to be really handy. It's difficult to trace out that slanted pattern without, because you can't just measure. You have a whole odd shape there. So we're going to trace these out on some dark dyed box elder burl, and I'll show you guys how to fit them. Now you're going to lay this down, and you could just trace off the two ends, but I like to trace all the way around because it helps you know which side you have for one, and just where you have the leeway. Now we can go ahead and rough cut this to length, stay at least a 1/16 out, and then we're going to grind into that line on the belt grinder. You could do it by hand with a file, a bastard file, or a rasp as well, kind of a fine rasp. I'm going to use the belt grinder, maybe a little bit of sandpaper just to fine tune it. But make sure when you're cutting it, leave at least a 1/16 there to so you can file in very precisely. See, now we have both of those scales fitted, and they fit real nicely. I got a nice tight fit on the frame. We can move it around. We have lots of room for everything. We can squeeze them right in there. So these will epoxy up real nice. You probably would have figured that out on your own if you try it yourself and you remove a little bit too much material. Well, it's not that much material. I mean, it's a fairly small piece, so you can start again if you're not using something super valuable. One thing I will point out now, since we're about to do glue up, this step you want to get right. You want to tape inside here against the liner. It can be a little bit finicky to do that, but if you remember these little pinholes here, what happens is as you epoxy this, clamp these in place, you push a whole bunch of epoxy out through the pinholes, and it seeps out in this space. So either your blade can't close, can't go in there, or it seeps out and goes up into your lock bar up here, which is definitely a pain and difficult to break free. Now once it's down there, you can see it's just loosely in there. All you need to do is take like a little screwdriver or something, and you can just stick it to the side, push it right in place. Now the easiest way to do this is to take a piece of tape, just like this, press it on real nice and tight, so really work it in there so it sticks all to the frame and to the very edges that you're going to want to cut. And I'll show you what I mean right now. If you have a real sharp razor blade, because you remember this can't stay out here because you need to put scales there. So if you get a blade in right against that frame, you can just snip right perfectly along the frame, just like that. This up here doesn't matter, it's just waste. But the cleaner you can get it, Okay, just work it back in there. If you do have a little bit of overhang still, like up right here, I can see I have a little bit of overhang. I can just go ahead and trim that off like that. But we have now a perfect seam. Do it to the other side. A perfect seam so no epoxy gets in on our lock bar. Now our scales are all glued up. We let that epoxy sit overnight. I use just a basic 2-part epoxy, a slow cure stuff. And if you've done a good job with your taping, you shouldn't have too much mess to clean up or anything like that. I'll take off as much tape as I can here now. Some of it's going to be stuck in the epoxy, and we'll get to the finishing process. Now at this point I'm gearing up here. I'm going to use my 2x42 belt grinder with a 60 grit belt. These are such tiny little scales, we don't have much material to remove. What you want to make sure is that you don't, I'm going to grind this right in until I actually touch the brass, and we can refinish the brass later. But you want to make sure you don't grind too much into the spine. If you do, you're going to grind into that lock bar, which you file a nice pattern on. You don't want to remove much of that, because then you're going to start changing the shape of your design in the lock bar. So I'll work this down both on the flats and on the spine and on the inside here. See if we can get it nice and close, and then we'll move to some finer grits. Now, I highly recommend for hobby work to keep a whole bunch of different sandpaper grits around. And I would highly recommend getting yourself some good quality sandpaper. There's a lot of sandpaper out there on the market that is of really, really poor quality. And I've tried a lot of different types of stuff. 3M paper with this backing here is the best stuff that I've personally used so far, and you can get it in all kinds of different grits. I get most of it from Canadian Tire. I know it's a bit pricey, but good paper lasts quite a long time. And if you're not doing a lot of work, like I do a lot of sanding just because of my work I had to do here in the shop for customers, but if you're not doing a lot of work like that, it'll last you a long time. Some good sandpaper. So buy several different packs, spend 40 or 50 bucks and get yourself some 220, 400, some 800, 1000, 2000. If you have those grits, you can put a polish on almost anything. So highly recommended you get yourself a nice selection. I'll just get my utility knife here. And I am going to use, as you can see here, a sanding block, like a foam-backed sanding pad for this. Works really well because it's not too harsh, and it'll sort of wrap some of the edges and stuff and just give you, it's a little easier to get out the deeper scratches with that. I think we're there with the sanding. I went all the way up to 2000 grit. Never sanding just with my hand. I used this sanding pad for every bit of it, and it's looking really good. Of course, there's only so far you can get with sandpaper, and let me show you the finish we have right now. You can start to see all that figure from the wood come through right now. Now the brass might look good here now to your eye, but I assure you it's full of striations. I'm not sure if you can see that. So what we're going to do is use a felt wheel on or a flannel wheel, sorry, on a bench grinder, and we'll put a polish on this, and you'll see the astounding difference here in just a minute. Now that is the difference a buffing wheel can make. Just look at that finish now compared to what we had before. Very little striations, and just a beautiful gleaming polish that you can see your figure in, as you can see there. Check out that lock bar. Isn't that pretty? Isn't that cool? of course that extends all the way out along. What a beautiful piece. That beautiful stabilized box elder burl there. Isn't that pretty? Well, that's it for this episode. I really hope you guys learned something throughout the build of this beautiful knife. If you didn't learn something, I at least hope you're entertained. Thank you guys so much for watching. You know, what a great hobby to be able to take a knife like this and turn it into something real special. From my experimenting around, as far as I can tell, most old knives that are of this design, the kind of traditional brass bolster with the lock back design like this, they're all made pretty well the same, even if it's not a buck. And there are a whole bunch of buck models that are designed this exact same way as well. So what a cool idea to go around hunting these down in like thrift stores or like pawn shops and things like that, and customize them. Could become a little source of side money. You could sell them. They're definitely worth a lot more when they've undergone a full customization like this. Or what a cool idea, let's say a guy's getting married and he buys a half dozen off of eBay for a cheap price, customizes them, and turns them into something real special like this. What a neat idea. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I want to give a big shout out to my sponsors. If you guys can go support them, I would really appreciate that, and I'm sure they would as well. As always, make sure you tune in next week to the Newfoundland Hobbyists.